HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents When the Ice is Gone, What a Greenland Ice Core Reveals About Earth's Tumultuous History and Perilous Future. By Paul Bierman. Read by David Marantz. Oh, Greenland is a dreadful place, a land that's never green, where there's ice and snow and the whale fishes blow, and the daylight's seldom seen, brave boys, the daylight's seldom seen. Anonymous, Greenland Whale Fisheries, 18th Century Sea Shanty. Prologue. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. Will you not speak to me? Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. April 4th, 2019, in Copenhagen, was almost a T-shirt day. Such warmth in early spring is unusual for Denmark, but this is a country where climate change has driven up average temperatures nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1875. I, though, am decidedly not warm. Standing inside a walk-in freezer bigger than many people's homes, my teeth are chattering loudly enough that I am sure the dozen or so scientists near me can hear them. It's well below zero as the fog from my breath slowly covers my beard in frost. Here, the temperature is always the same. This glistening, windowless freezer was purpose-built to store ice. Not the ice you use to cool drinks, although you could, and some have done exactly that, but long cores of ice extracted from the world's great ice sheets and glaciers. Over more than 6 decades, teams of drillers and scientists living and working in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth, places where bare skin freezes solid in minutes, where the sun never sets at the height of summer and doesn't rise in the dead of winter, collected the ice stored here. I am in a rest home for these ice cores, slender, mostly transparent cylinders now cut into sections a few feet long and only inches wide. Curators here treat ice cores like rare books, with great care. They store them in meticulously catalogued boxes loaded 4 high on sturdy metal shelves. Laid out on the ground, end to end, the ice in this freezer alone would stretch for miles, until, of course, it melted into one long linear puddle. Today, we are not here for the ice cores, interesting as they are. Rather, we've come to see something far less common. Cores of what lay beneath the ice, brown lumps of frozen soil in vintage glass jars. If you laid these frost-mantled cylinders of earth end to end, they wouldn't even stretch the length of a car, and altogether they weigh 69 pounds. My Danish colleagues have asked me to fly across the Atlantic to see these samples because I have made a long career of dating old things, especially rocks and soil from the Arctic. To understand the coming and going of ice sheets, I analyze samples of sand in a dustless clean room and use repurposed particle accelerators from the 1960s, machines that once charmed physicists who now need bigger and better equipment. I use these instruments to weigh atoms and then count them one by one. Using such data, I've deciphered landscapes around the world, including the rocky desert of Namibia, the humid Brazilian rainforest, the dry lands of Israel, and the folded Appalachian Mountains. Yet Greenland and its ice hold a special place in my heart. During 4 trips and a dozen helicopter flights there, I've seen some amazing sights, but I had never seen anything like these cookie jars holding frozen sand from beneath the ice sheet with a dusting of gravel and a hint of silt. Over my desk, there's now a photograph of that day. In it, I am holding a jar in my gloved hand, smiling. Getting to Copenhagen, I crossed 6 time zones and earned 4,233 frequent flyer miles. As a passenger on a crowded series of flights from Vermont to Denmark, I added about 1,000 pounds of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. That's unsettling, because I study when and how ice sheets, like the one covering Greenland, come and go over time as the climate warms and cools in sync with rising and falling concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Greenland's ice sheet is now shrinking rapidly, and my flight, which passed over the southern tip of the island, just helped melt a little more ice. The jars of frozen soil in our hands came from Camp Century, a U.S. Army base hidden entirely inside Greenland's ice sheet. The camp was about 120 miles from the northwest coast of Greenland, and nearly a mile of ice separated the surface of the glacier from the rock and frozen soil below. You would not be wrong to say that Camp Century was in the middle of nowhere. In 1960, Army engineers started drilling straight down from inside the camp with the goal of collecting continuous samples of ice from the top to the bottom of the world's second-largest ice sheet. After half a decade of work, on July 2, 1966, they pulled out the last sample from a depth of 4,506 feet below the snowy surface surrounding the camp. On that day, I was 4 years old, the Cold War was raging, and the moon would remain free of human footprints for another 3 years and 18 days. Working in frigid snow tunnels, with no heat and no daylight, the Army engineers had just finished drilling the world's first complete deep ice core. The drillers had not only sampled the entire thickness of the Greenland ice sheet, but had also brought up more than 11 feet of frozen soil from beneath the ice, a record that stands to this day. Nearly 53 years later, that material filled the jars in the Copenhagen freezer. We didn't know it then, but the soil that lay beneath the ice sheet was keeping far more interesting secrets than we ever could have imagined on that warm April morning. Fast forward 3 months to the end of July 2019 in our laboratory at the University of Vermont. Yesterday, a van delivered 2 samples of the soil from below Camp Century, both still frozen solid after a several-day trip from Denmark. 2 other geologists, Drew Christ and Leah Williamson, were there with me. Between us, we'd processed thousands of samples. Yet nothing had prepared us for what was about to happen. First, we let the samples, safely sealed in plastic bags, melt slowly. Then we separated the sand from the gravel and the mud. I was hot, tired, and staring mindlessly into a bin of murky water when I saw something small and dark floating on the surface. I tossed off my safety goggles and grabbed my glasses. "Drew," I said, "you need to see this. I think these are plant parts." From the look Drew gave me, it was clear he wasn't buying it. We were both exhausted. I'd been teaching a summer high school environmental science program for almost a week, and he was just days away from defending his doctoral thesis. I grabbed a small plastic pipette, sucked up a few of the black bits, and placed them on a white Teflon tray the size and shape of a hollow ice hockey puck. I handed the tray to Drew. Quickly, he placed it under the microscope in the corner of the room, flipped on the glaring LED lights, and looked down the dual eyepiece. Silence. I remember best the expression of utter shock on Drew's face when he stood up and turned toward me. He glanced at Leah, Same expression. Astonishment. We took turns looking into the scope and babbling. Between the sand grains, we could see leaves and twigs, remnants of a frozen ecosystem, ancient Arctic tundra vegetation perfectly preserved in nature's deep freeze for who knows how long. In that moment, we knew that at least once before, Greenland's ice had melted away, allowing plants to grow where today there was a mile-thick glacier. Under the microscope, we saw irrefutable evidence that ice wasn't a stable, permanent fixture on the island. Sometime in the past, Greenland's massive glacier, which today covers an area the size of France, was far smaller. I've done science for 40 years, and this remains my only eureka moment. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. I brought the high schoolers in for a look, and Drew explained that these plants once sat beneath an ice sheet, and that they might be 1 million or more years old. Cool, they said. The Camp Century ice core was not only the first to reach the bottom of any ice sheet, but now, more than a half-century later, it has a new honor. It's the first, and so far only, ice core, chock full of bits and pieces of ancient plants, insects, and mosses. On that summer afternoon, 2 samples of brown pebbly mud began rewriting the history of the Greenland ice sheet, one fossil and one sand grain at a time. The high school kids were right. This was cool. And it was only the beginning of what that frozen earth in those 1970 vintage glass jars was going to tell us. Soon, a couple of frozen lumps of soil would show the world, beset by a rapidly warming and changing climate, that Greenland's ice sheet was fragile, far more fragile than most wanted to believe. We needed to find out when it had melted and why. This is a story about Greenland, its ice sheet, and climate change, both in the past and today. The protagonist is an ice core that radically changed our understanding of Earth, its climate, and their intertwined history. Below the ice sheet's snowy surface is another, and arguably equally important story, one about unexpected outcomes and their consequences. No one expected climate change at the start of the Industrial Revolution, but as the world burned greater and greater amounts of fossil fuels over the last 2 centuries, the impacts became increasingly clear. We know unambiguously now that warming and the loss of ice is a consequence of human actions. When Edwin Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania in 1859, he didn't imagine the outcome would be Greenland's ice sheet melting, transferring what had been frozen water on land into the global ocean. None of the men who drilled the world's first deep ice core knew in 1966 that their work would become so important decades later, after most of them were dead. Yet a few handfuls of frozen soil from nearly a mile below those drillers' feet showed that Greenland's ice sheet was unstable even in the absence of human meddling with Earth's climate. We know now that 400,000 years ago, during an interglacial interval probably no warmer than today, tundra vegetation replaced ice without the assistance of fossil fuel-driven global warming. Camp Century, the quirky, futuristic city that the U.S. Army carved into Greenland's ice sheet in 1960, is a critically important supporting character without which the critical ice core wouldn't exist. But to figure out Camp Century's place in both human and climate history, as well as to understand what the science done at the camp says about our collective future, we need to go deeper deeper into the history of Greenland and its ice sheet, deeper into the people who built the remote Arctic camp and made its ice core possible, and deeper into the Cold War that drove so much frenzied American activity in the fragile Arctic. Such context shows that the Camp Century ice core was far more than a feat of engineering. It was the beginning of a more nuanced understanding of the Arctic in general and the science of ice sheets in particular. The chapters that follow weave together a tale of people, places, history, engineering, and science, both on Greenland, a remote, largely ice-covered Arctic island, and elsewhere. That work changed the scientific world in the 1960s, and today it is changing the way we think about the unintended impacts of climate change. The story of Greenland's ice is an odyssey many millions of years long, in contrast to that of Camp Century, which lasted less than a decade. In the Western view of things, Greenland has always been about the outer limits of human endurance, people versus nature, and meeting the challenge of the unknown and seemingly unknowable. Be that by crossing the ice sheet for the first time, detecting Soviet missiles flying over the Arctic on a ballistic path to New York City, or drilling through nearly a mile of ice. A drive to know and a certain stubbornness kept Robert Peary and Matthew Henson, their men and their dog teams pulling 200-pound sledges toward the North Pole in 1909 in the same way that they motivated Army drillers and scientists to spend 6 years coring before they finally got the equipment and techniques right and reached the bottom of the ice sheet. Human persistence in the face of challenges, both personal and professional, is central to this story. Most people think of science as equations and equipment. But science is people, and people are unpredictable. They freeze to death. They leave their jobs. They threaten to throw an irreplaceable ice core into Lake Erie, and they misplace things like frozen soil collected from below nearly a mile of ice. But to understand people and their day-to-day lives is to understand why the American military and scientific occupation of the Arctic happened, why thousands of men spent parts of their lives away from their families, living inside an ice sheet only 800 miles from the North Pole, and why today 8 billion people are now barreling headlong into a global climate crisis. People are the reason that the frozen soil from beneath the ice sheet vanished and then, more than 20 years later, reappeared, safe and sound, in a Danish ice core repository. Earth is complicated. In 40-plus years of studying our planet, I've learned that the hard way. Over my career, it's become all the rage to consider Earth as a system with feedbacks that don't respond simply and smoothly to pushes and pulls. The climate system is full of jumps, times and places where temperature and precipitation patterns change abruptly. Wally Broecker, one of the first and most outspoken scientists to decipher Earth's climate system, said it well. The Earth tends to over-respond. The Earth system has amplifiers and feedbacks that mushroom small impacts into large responses. Greenland's ice and the frozen soil beneath it preserve the memory of such erratic behavior. They give us climate scientists pause. Greenland's ice sheet is central to Earth's climate system and its response to human-induced climate change. When white ice and snow melt, they stop reflecting solar energy in the 24-hour sunshine of the Arctic summer. Dark-colored rocks and green tundra take their place, soaking up the sun's energy and warming the planet. Water locked up for millennia in solid ice on land is suddenly freed and races to the ocean. People living by the coast 10,000 miles away from the Arctic then watch their homes go beneath the waves. Greenland has exceptionally long arms. They envelop our entire planet and its people in one way or another. Greenland's future is our future. The more we understand about Earth, the more likely we will be to treat it better going forward. Geologists use the present to explain the past and use the past as our guide to the future. Greenland's massive ice sheet is an archive, and ice cores, like the ones from Camp Century, are frozen Rosetta Stones. Once we learned how to decipher those cores, they revealed Earth's climate history, and thus a glimpse into our collective future catalyzed by seeing the past more clearly. As we face the increasing heat of a rapidly changing global climate, ice cores are key to answering one of the most pressing scientific questions of our time. What will become of Greenland's ice sheet as humans warm the Earth? Every December, for as long as I can remember, the radio station where I live has played the same recording. It's of an older Vermonter with a thick New England accent reading Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. This year, when I heard the story and noted that the grass on my front lawn was still green and bare of snow, I started to wonder if we, the people of this planet, are a collective Scrooge. If so, then the Camp Century ice core could be the ghost of Christmas past. But then I thought, what about the frozen plant fossils, so well preserved in the frozen soil beneath the ice? Although ancient, those bits of moss, twigs, and leaves could well be the ghost of Christmas yet to come, a disturbing way for us to envision Greenland's future. A future when the ice is gone again. 1. The Inhospitable Island. Scientists still do not appear to understand sufficiently that all earth sciences must contribute evidence toward unveiling the state of our planet in earlier times, and that the truth of the matter can only be reached by combining all this evidence. Alfred Wegener, The Origin of Continents and Oceans. 2/3 of Greenland lies above the Arctic Circle. To the north, sea ice surrounds the land. Only in the height of summer does the ice break up to reveal open water. To the south, the North Atlantic births storms that pummel the island's rocky coast with snow in the long winter and rain in the short summer. Ocean currents sweep around the island, carrying armadas of icebergs. Each of these massive blocks of ice once calved from a glacier that grinds down the island's steep-walled fjords and into the sea. Despite these harsh conditions, native people thrived on Greenland for thousands of years without the benefit of machines or fossil fuels. 3 successive waves of people came to the island, starting between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, presumably from Ellesmere Island to the west in Canada, a narrow, often ice-covered crossing to far northwestern Greenland. In a place as remote as Greenland, the archaeological evidence is scarce, but scattered excavations, oral history, and more recently, DNA analyses paint an incomplete but complex picture of the island's peopling. First came the Sakak, who settled the west coast of the island about 4,500 years ago. DNA of human hair recovered from a burial in Greenland's permanently frozen ground shows that these people came from the area around the Bering Sea. They were genetically distinct from Native Americans. About 2,500 years ago, the Dorset replaced the Sakak civilization. Finally, about 1,500 years ago, the Thule Inuit, who had a genetic makeup distinct from that of the Dorset, came to Greenland from Alaska through the Canadian Arctic. Oral tradition suggests that the Thule simply overwhelmed the Dorset, who were timid and easily put to flight. One after another, the last two cultures settled around the coast of nearly the entire island. In this treeless landscape, the native Greenlanders made use of driftwood stranded on ancient beaches, now far above the waves, for fires, carving, and construction. In the winter, the Thule people at least appear to have lived communally in partially subterranean sod homes, a way to reduce the impact of the winter cold by relying on the thermal inertia of the ground. In warmer seasons, they traveled and hunted as small family units. Their diet varied seasonally, but depended heavily on marine resources, which are plentiful around Greenland. The Thule used toggling harpoons to capture whales and made their clothing from animals native to the Arctic. They traveled quickly and widely using dog sleds and skin-covered boats called umiak. Captain John Ross, on an 1818 search by the British for the Northwest Passage, found the northwestern Greenland Inuit equipped with iron tools, including knife blades and harpoon tips. The Inuit had cold-forged iron that they mined from the pieces of a meteorite that weighed over 145,000 pounds. The meteorite, composed of iron and nickel, is known to the Inuit as saviksue, meaning great irons, and to meteoriticists as the Cape York meteorite. Its composition is so distinctive that tools made from saviksue allow archaeologists to trace trade routes to southern Greenland and halfway across the Canadian Arctic. It's difficult to estimate the terrestrial age of such a large meteorite. Several attempts have failed, but saviksue probably landed when the ice sheet was larger than it is today, because there's no indication that the impact disturbed the ground beneath any of the pieces. That meant the meteorite landed at least 12,000 years ago. Most of saviksue is no longer in the Arctic. In 1896 and 1897, 12 years before they claimed to have reached the North Pole, American explorers Peary and Henson brought 3 pieces of the meteorite to New York. Henson was a black man, a consummate explorer, and by most accounts reached the pole ahead of Peary. These pieces, the heaviest of which weighs 68,000 pounds, still sit in the New York Museum of Natural History. Knud Rasmussen, a Danish explorer, took a smaller piece, called Savik, to Copenhagen in 1925. Another large piece, called Agpalilik, came to Copenhagen in 1963. The last time I was in Denmark, I saw it sitting, a bit rusty and alone, in front of the Geologisk Museum. There was no sign to tell me that the rock came from Greenland, or how important its metal was to the Inuit before trade with outsiders brought iron, refined elsewhere, to the island. Norse explorers were the next people to attempt living on Greenland. The ruins of Eric the Red's farm, Brattahlid, sit across the Tunneliarfik fjord from the town of Narsarsuaq. When I was last there, a herd of sheep grazed around the massive stone foundation of the farm's church as a mix of rain and snow poured down. About 983 CE, Eric had arrived in Greenland with a small group of men, an advance party to investigate the island. At the occupation's peak, there were several thousand Norse living in Greenland. They settled the south and west coasts in what are known confusingly as the Eastern and Western settlements. For almost 4 centuries, they hunted, fished, and farmed, and also traded walrus ivory with Europe. There's ample written evidence of contact between the Norse and the Inuit. By 1400 CE, the western settlements were empty. 50 years later, so were the eastern settlements. For decades.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?